By the time I reached the little coastal town of Harbor's Edge, I had almost forgotten what silence sounded like. Back in Boston, silence never really existed. There was always another subway rumbling beneath the streets, another phone buzzing on a cafe table, another deadline creeping closer while pretending to stay far away. Here, the loudest thing I could hear was the distant cry of a gull drifting over the harbor and the soft rhythm of waves brushing against weathered wooden docks. It was strange enough to make me glance at my phone, wondering if I had somehow lost signal and stepped outside the world. The narrow road leading into town curved along the shoreline for nearly 3 miles, lined with white fences, wildflowers, and cottages that looked as though they had been standing there for generations without ever needing to prove anything. Even the air felt different. It carried salt, pine, and something warm I couldn't quite name, as if every breeze had traveled through someone's kitchen before reaching the ocean. My roommate, Noah Carter, had insisted I come here for exactly 1 week. He hadn't explained much over the past month except repeating the same sentence every few days. "Trust me, Ethan. Just come to the farm." At first, I thought he was joking. Noah rarely talked about his hometown during the 2 years we shared a cramped apartment. I knew he disappeared every fall for harvest season, came back with homemade jam, and somehow managed to fix almost anything that broke in our apartment without watching a single tutorial online. That was about it. Then, 3 days ago, he called instead of texting. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Please," he had said, "I really want you to see this place before you make any decisions about your future." He never begged for anything. That was probably why I agreed. The guest house sat on a quiet bluff overlooking the water, painted pale blue with white shutters and a wraparound porch filled with rocking chairs that faced the sea instead of the road. A brass bell chimed softly as I pushed open the screen door. Behind the front desk stood an older woman with silver hair gathered into a loose braid and reading, glasses hanging from a colorful cord around her neck. She smiled before I even introduced myself, as though she'd been expecting me all morning. "You must be Ethan," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret. Welcome. Noah called twice to make sure your room was ready." I laughed. That sounds like him. He's been looking forward to this visit more than he'll admit. She handed me an old-fashioned brass key instead of a key card. "Room 4. Best view in the house." As she helped me with the check-in book, I noticed framed photographs covering nearly every wall. Fishing boats, families, sunsets, local festivals. Some looked decades old. Others seemed recent. Every face carried the same relaxed expression, as though nobody here measured life by calendars or meetings. "First time in Harbor's Edge?" Margaret asked. "First time anywhere that feels this still." She smiled knowingly. "People usually come here because they're running from something." Before I could answer, the front door opened again. A young man stepped inside carrying a wooden crate filled with fresh vegetables and wildflowers. He wasn't dressed like someone trying to impress anyone. Worn jeans, faded flannel sleeves rolled to his elbows, muddy work boots, and wind-tousled brown hair that looked like he'd forgotten mirrors existed. He set the crate beside the counter with quiet care before looking up. His eyes briefly met mine, calm and unreadable, then shifted naturally toward his mother. "Pick the tomatoes before the rain," he said. His voice was low, steady, completely unhurried. Margaret smiled. "Perfect timing. Daniel, this is Ethan. He's Noah's roommate from Boston." Daniel nodded once. "Nice to meet you." That was all. No dramatic introduction. No instant connection. No spark that made the room feel smaller. Just one ordinary moment between two strangers. Still, as he turned to carry another crate outside, one thought settled into my mind without asking permission. He looked like someone who had never been in a hurry. I couldn't explain why that stayed with me longer than it should have. Maybe because everyone I knew back home was always rushing towards something they were afraid to lose. Daniel moved like time belonged to him. I watched him disappear down the porch steps, wondering how someone my age could seem so completely at peace. Then Margaret quietly said something that made every peaceful thought vanish. "If Noah invited you here," she said while closing the guest book, "then whatever he's planning, he's finally decided it's time." She offered no explanation, only a gentle smile before walking into the kitchen, leaving me alone with a brass room key, the sound of distant waves, and a question that suddenly felt much bigger than a simple vacation. The next morning I woke before my alarm, not because of noise, but because there was almost none. Sunlight spilled through the white curtains, painting slow golden lines across the wooden floor while the sound of distant waves blended with birdsong outside my window. For the first time in months, I reached for my phone and realized I had nothing urgent waiting for me. No missed calls. No client emails marked urgent. No calendar reminders demanding another impossible day. I left the phone on the bedside table and stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee Margaret had quietly left outside my door. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs, calm enough to reflect the pale morning sky like polished glass. Somewhere below, fishing boats drifted toward open water at an almost lazy pace. It felt impossible that the rest of the country was already rushing through another workday, while this town seemed perfectly content to let the morning arrive whenever it pleased. After breakfast, Margaret pointed me toward Noah's farm. "About a mile and a half inland," she said. "You cannot miss it. Just follow the road until the mailbox with the blue lighthouse painted on it." The walk itself became part of the experience. Instead of traffic lights and crowded sidewalks, there were gravel roads bordered by wildflowers, weathered fences, and fields that rolled gently toward the hills. Every few hundred feet someone waved from a porch or slowed their pickup truck long enough to smile before continuing on. Nobody seemed curious about why I was there. They simply accepted that I belonged on the road for that moment. I was halfway through wondering whether everyone in Harbor's Edge had been born unusually friendly when I spotted Noah repairing a wooden fence beside an open pasture. He looked exactly the same as he did in Boston, except somehow different. His shoulders seemed lighter. His smile came more easily. Even his laugh sounded fuller as he greeted me with a quick hug before stepping back to admire my expression. "You actually made it," he said. "I kept expecting you to text that you changed your mind." "I almost did." He grinned. "I know." Before I could ask about the mysterious surprise he had hinted at, he handed me a pair of work gloves. "First things first. Help me finish this fence." I stared at him. "Seriously? You cannot appreciate a farm without getting dirt on your shoes." I laughed despite myself and accepted the gloves. For the next 2 hours we replaced loose boards, carried buckets of nails, and watched a small herd of goats inspect our work with remarkable confidence. It was simple, repetitive labor, but strangely satisfying. Nobody checked the time. Nobody rushed to finish. We worked until the fence stood straight again simply because it needed to. Around noon, Daniel appeared driving an old green pickup loaded with baskets of peaches and fresh bread from the bakery downtown. He parked beneath an enormous oak tree and climbed out carrying lunch as though this happened every day. "Mother insisted everyone eat before working anymore," he said. "Apparently she believes hunger makes people stubborn." Noah laughed. "She is usually right." We spread everything across a weathered picnic table overlooking the fields. Conversation drifted easily from local festivals to weather forecasts, fishing stories, and the oldest lighthouse along the coast. Daniel spoke only when he had something worth saying, and somehow that made everyone else slow down enough to listen. There was nothing mysterious about him anymore. Yet I found myself noticing the smallest details anyway. The way he waited until everyone else filled their plates first. The quiet patience with which he answered Noah's endless jokes. The comfortable silence he never seemed eager to interrupt. It was not charm in the usual sense. It was steadiness. The kind that made other people feel less hurried without realizing why. As we finished lunch, Noah stood and brushed the dust from his jeans. "Tomorrow," he said with an almost impossible smile, "I am finally going to show you why I asked you to come here." Daniel looked toward him for just a second before lowering his eyes to his empty coffee mug. It was a tiny reaction, easy to miss, but something about it made me wonder if he already knew the answer to a question nobody had asked yet. The following morning arrived wrapped in a thin layer of sea mist that drifted lazily across the fields before the rising sun dissolved it into shimmering ribbons of light. Noah was already outside when I reached the farmhouse, leaning against the porch railing with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You are getting used to waking up early," he said with a grin as he handed me one. "I think this town is cheating," I answered. "It makes sleeping feel optional." He laughed softly. "That is probably the nicest thing anyone has ever said about Harbor's Edge." Instead of explaining the surprise he kept promising, Noah suggested we spend the morning helping at the weekly farmers market before heading somewhere special in the afternoon. I was beginning to realize that every answer here arrived one step later than expected. Somehow, I no longer minded. The market occupied a grassy square beside the harbor where white tents lined the waterfront in neat rows. Fresh peaches, homemade pies, handcrafted furniture, wildflower bouquets, and jars of golden honey filled every table. Children chased one another between booths while musicians played quiet acoustic songs that blended naturally with the sound of gulls circling overhead. Nobody seemed interested in selling as quickly as possible. Conversations lasted longer than purchases. People remembered names, birthdays, favorite recipes, and stories from years before. It felt less like a marketplace and more like a weekly reunion. Noah disappeared for several minutes, greeting nearly everyone by name before returning with Daniel, who carried 2 wooden crates filled with tomatoes and herbs. "We need another pair of hands," Noah said. Apparently, I volunteered both of us. I rolled my eyes. "Funny how I never remember agreeing to any of your plans." "You keep showing up," he replied. "That counts." Daniel smiled quietly before setting the crates onto the table. "You will learn that saying no to Noah is mostly theoretical." Throughout the morning, we arranged vegetables, greeted customers, and packed paper bags with fresh produce. I noticed Daniel never tried to persuade anyone to buy more than they needed. Sometimes he even suggested they wait until next week if the fruit was not quite at its best. "You could sell everything faster," I whispered while an elderly couple walked away carrying only a few peaches. Daniel shrugged gently. "Maybe, but they trust us because we tell the truth. That matters longer than one good day." His answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Back in Boston, almost everything revolved around urgency, competition, and convincing people to choose now before they changed their minds. Here, trust seemed more valuable than speed. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the crowd slowly thinned until only a handful of visitors remained. Noah checked his watch for the first time all day and smiled to himself. Almost time. I expected him to lead me towards some hidden building or breathtaking viewpoint. But instead, he asked Daniel to drive us to the northern edge of the property, where an old gravel road disappeared between towering cedar trees. The drive lasted barely 10 minutes, ending beside a weathered wooden gate that looked as though it had not been replaced in decades. Beyond it stood a gently sloping meadow overlooking the ocean. Wild grasses swayed in the breeze, dotted with patches of lavender and daisies. At the center of the field rested an old red barn with fresh paint on only one side, as if someone had been restoring it little by little. Noah stepped out of the truck and stared at the barn without saying a word. Daniel remained beside the fence, unusually quiet, his hands resting in his jacket pockets. The silence stretched long enough that I finally spoke. "Is this the place?" Noah nodded slowly but did not move. "Closer." "Not yet," he said. "There is one thing you need to understand first." Before he could continue, Margaret's pickup appeared at the end of the gravel road. She climbed out carrying a small cardboard box tied carefully with blue ribbon. She walked straight toward Noah, placed the box in his hands, and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze without saying a single word. Noah looked down at it, took a slow breath, and then met my eyes with an expression I had never seen before. It was not excitement. It was relief mixed with nervousness. The look of someone who had carried the same secret for a very long time and had finally decided he could not carry it alone. Noah turned the small cardboard box over in his hands for several long seconds before carefully loosening the blue ribbon. The breeze carried the scent of salt and cedar through the open meadow, yet none of us spoke. Even the distant sound of the ocean seemed softer, as though the entire hillside had decided to wait with us. Inside the box rested a stack of photographs held together by a faded leather strap. Noah smiled to himself before offering the bundle to me. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "They belong to the story." I slid the strap away and looked at the first photograph. It showed the old barn exactly as it stood now, except the paint had almost disappeared and tall weeds surrounded the doors. The next picture showed the same building after the roof had been repaired. Another revealed fresh windows. Then came photographs of volunteers replacing beams, planting flowers, rebuilding fences, and restoring the surrounding meadow little by little through every season. Some pictures were taken in bright summer sunlight. Others captured snow covering the fields. Years of careful work unfolded one image at a time. "You have been fixing this place for a long time," I said. Noah nodded. "Almost 3 years." By yourself. Daniel answered before Noah could. Not always. He pointed toward one of the photographs. Half the town showed up whenever they had a free afternoon. I looked more closely. Faces I recognized from the farmer's market smiled back at me from nearly every picture. Margaret carried paintbrushes. The baker balanced lumber on his shoulder. The harbor mechanic repaired old windows. Teenagers planted flowers while retired fishermen rebuilt fences. It was never one person's project. Somehow the entire community had quietly adopted the barn as though restoring it meant restoring a small piece of themselves. Why? I finally asked. Noah looked toward the ocean before answering. Because some places deserve another chance. His words sounded simple, yet something told me they carried a meaning that had nothing to do with old buildings. We walked slowly toward the barn, following a narrow path lined with lavender that buzzed gently with bees drifting from flower to flower. Fresh white paint covered only the front wall, while the remaining sides still showed weathered wood waiting for their turn. Nothing about the restoration looked rushed. Every improvement blended naturally with the age of the structure instead of trying to erase it. Daniel rested one hand against the barn door with quiet familiarity. My grandfather built this place, he said. When storms damaged it years ago, everyone assumed it would eventually collapse. He smiled faintly. Noah disagreed. Noah laughed under his breath. I have always been stubborn. That is the polite version, Daniel replied, earning another laugh from both of us. The easy conversation somehow made the unanswered questions even larger. I still had no idea why Noah had insisted I travel hundreds of miles just to stand beside an old barn. As if reading my thoughts, he opened one of the wide wooden doors. Sunlight poured through the entrance, revealing an enormous open space filled with ladders, covered furniture, stacks of reclaimed wood, and carefully organized tools. Yet one detail immediately stood out. Along the far wall, hidden beneath large canvas sheets, stood several tall shapes that had clearly been built with intention. They were too symmetrical to be storage shelves and too carefully covered to be forgotten equipment. I took a step closer, but Noah gently raised a hand. Not yet. He smiled apologetically. I promised you a surprise, and I have waited too long to ruin the timing now. I laughed. You really enjoy making people curious. Only when it is worth the wait. Before I could ask another question, Margaret appeared carrying a picnic basket while several neighbors arrived from the road with folding chairs and homemade desserts. Nobody acted as though they had been invited to an event. Instead, they moved with the comfortable rhythm of people who simply belong together. Watching them greet one another by first name, exchange recipes, and tease Noah about his endless projects, I began to understand something that had quietly escaped me since arriving in Harbor's Edge. This town did not build relationships around special occasions. It built ordinary days so well that they eventually became unforgettable. As everyone settled beneath the shade of the old cedar trees, I noticed Daniel watching Noah with quiet confidence, almost as if he already knew exactly how the rest of the day would unfold. Noah caught his eye for only a moment before giving the smallest nod. Whatever secret still waited inside the barn, they had been protecting it together for far longer than I had ever imagined. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, the gathering beneath the cedar trees felt less like an event and more like a family dinner that had simply happened to include everyone. Margaret passed around homemade blackberry pie while neighbors traded stories that began years ago and somehow continued as though no time had passed at all. I found myself listening more than speaking. Every conversation revealed another small piece of Harbor's Edge, another reason people stayed instead of searching for somewhere bigger. It was impossible not to compare it with Boston, where most conversations eventually circled back to work, promotions, rent, or traffic. Here, people measured time differently. They remembered the year someone planted an apple orchard, the summer the lighthouse reopened, or the winter everyone gathered to repair fishing boats after a storm. The milestones were shared instead of individual. After dinner, several neighbors headed home, waving as they disappeared down the gravel road. The meadow grew quieter until only Margaret, Noah, Daniel, and I remained. Beside the barn, the sun hung low over the ocean, turning the sky into soft shades of gold and pale orange. Daniel quietly collected empty dishes while Margaret folded blankets with the practiced rhythm of someone who had hosted hundreds of evenings exactly like this. Noah wandered toward the fence overlooking the cliffs, resting both hands on the weathered wood. I joined him without saying anything. For several minutes, we simply watched the waves rolling toward the shore below. "Do you ever miss Boston?" I finally asked. He smiled without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Sometimes I miss the people. I do not miss the pace." I nodded. I used to think slowing down meant falling behind. And now, I considered the question longer than I expected. Now I am not sure what I was chasing. Noah laughed quietly. "That is the funny thing about constantly running. Eventually you forget where you were trying to go." His words settled into the silence between us. They sounded less like advice and more like something he had learned the difficult way. Behind us, Daniel finished loading the last basket into Margaret's truck before walking over with 2 glass bottles of sparkling apple cider. He handed one to me, another to Noah, then leaned comfortably against the fence. "Mother says every important conversation deserves something worth drinking." Noah smiled. "She says that about almost every conversation. That is why life is enjoyable here." We laughed together, and for a brief moment nothing felt complicated. Then Daniel looked toward the barn before speaking again. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" Noah answered almost immediately. "Every detail. You were convinced nobody could save it." Noah nodded. "I was. But you kept coming back anyway." Daniel's quiet observation seemed aimed at more than an old building. Noah looked down at the bottle in his hands before speaking softly. "Some things deserve patience before they deserve certainty." The sentence lingered in my mind long after nobody replied. I had heard similar ideas throughout the week without noticing the pattern. Trust over speed. Restoration over replacement. Patience before certainty. It was as though the entire town lived by a set of principles nobody had ever written down because everyone already understood them. The breeze carried the scent of lavender across the meadow as daylight slowly surrendered to evening. Small lights flickered on inside nearby farmhouses, one by one, like stars appearing across the hills. I realized I had not checked my phone since breakfast. When I finally reached into my pocket, the battery was nearly full because I had barely touched it all day. I smiled to myself before slipping it back without unlocking the screen. Noah noticed. "That might be a personal record." "It probably is." He laughed. "I had a feeling this place would do that to you." Before I could respond, Daniel glanced toward the old barn and took a slow breath. "Everything inside is ready," he said quietly. "Whenever you are." Noah closed his eyes for just a moment, as though gathering courage that had taken years to build. Then he opened them and looked directly at me. There was no hesitation left in his expression, only quiet determination. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I am finally opening those doors. And once you see what is waiting inside, you are going to understand why I needed you to come here before you made the biggest decision of your life." The next morning the sky was perfectly clear, the kind of bright coastal morning that made every color seem a little richer than the day before. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water through the open meadow as Noah unlocked the heavy wooden doors of the old barn. This time he did not stop me. Instead, he stepped aside with a quiet smile. "Go ahead," he said. "It has always been yours to discover." I walked forward slowly, expecting another unfinished restoration project. Instead, I froze after only a few steps. The enormous space that had looked like a construction site just yesterday had been completely transformed. Sunlight streamed through the restored skylights, filling the barn with warm natural light that spilled across polished wooden floors. The walls were painted a soft white, interrupted only by exposed beams that preserved the character of the original building. Large windows overlooked the ocean, allowing the blue horizon to become part of the room itself. Along one side stood carefully designed photography workstations, editing desks, shelves filled with vintage cameras, handcrafted frames, lighting equipment, and books about landscape photography. On the opposite wall hung dozens of empty wooden frames waiting to display future photographs. At the far end of the barn, elegant lettering carved into reclaimed oak caught my attention. It simply read, "Ethan Brooks Studio." I stared at the words, convinced I had misunderstood what I was seeing. "Noah," my voice barely rose above a whisper. "What is this?" He stepped beside me, keeping his eyes on the room instead of my face. "About 2 years ago, you came home after another 14-hour workday. You sat on our apartment floor because you were too exhausted to make it to the couch." He smiled faintly at the memory. "You told me that if life were different, you would open a photography studio somewhere quiet. You wanted windows instead of office lights." Real people instead of rushed clients. A place where every portrait had a story. I looked around the room again. Every detail matched conversations I barely remembered having. The wide editing desk I once described while complaining about my tiny apartment workspace. The oversized north-facing windows I had said every photographer dreamed about. Even the reading corner held the exact rocking chair I had once pointed out in an antique shop window months earlier. "I thought you forgot those conversations," I said quietly. Noah finally looked at me. I never forgot any of them. Behind us, Margaret and Daniel entered without interrupting. They stood near the doorway with gentle smiles, allowing the moment to belong to us. Noah continued, his voice calm but unmistakably emotional. "Every time you said you were trapped in a life that no longer felt like yours, I remembered it. Every time you talked about what you wished you could build someday, I wrote it down after you went to sleep. This studio is not my dream, Ethan. It has always been yours." I slowly turned in a full circle, trying to absorb what surrounded me. Nothing inside the barn looked expensive for the sake of appearance. Everything had been chosen with purpose. Every beam restored instead of replaced. Every piece of furniture handcrafted by local carpenters. Every window positioned to capture changing coastal light throughout the day. This was not a surprise assembled over a weekend. It was years of quiet attention built into wood, glass, and patience. Daniel walked toward one of the empty gallery walls and gently placed a small envelope in my hand. Inside was a single photograph Noah had secretly taken through the apartment window back in Boston. I was holding my camera while watching sunrise spill across nearby rooftops, smiling in a way I did not even remember. Written neatly on the back were the words, "The day you remembered why you started taking pictures." My throat tightened. "You kept this?" Noah nodded. "I kept believing there would be a day when you needed to see it again." Outside, the wind stirred the lavender beyond the open barn doors while waves rolled steadily toward the shore below the cliffs. The entire room remained silent until Margaret finally spoke with a warmth that filled every corner of the restored barn. "A building can be repaired," she said softly. "But sometimes what people truly need is a place that reminds them who they were before they became too busy to recognize themselves." For a long time, nobody spoke. The restored studio remained filled with nothing but the sound of waves drifting through the open windows and the occasional cry of a gull somewhere above the cliffs. I slowly walked from one side of the room to the other, running my fingertips across the smooth wooden desks, the handcrafted shelves, and the empty gallery frames waiting for photographs that did not exist yet. It felt impossible that this place had been quietly taking shape, while I spent 2 years convincing myself my real dreams belonged to another version of my life. Noah gave me all the time I needed. He never asked what I thought or whether I liked it. Somehow that made the silence feel even more generous. Eventually, Margaret and Daniel slipped outside without saying goodbye, leaving only Noah and me inside the barn. Sunlight shifted across the floor as the morning grew brighter. "You should say something," Noah said with a nervous laugh. I looked at him, still struggling to find words that felt large enough. "I do not know how." He nodded as though he had expected that answer. "Then let me make this easier." He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a plain white envelope. Inside was a printed email. I recognized the company logo immediately. It was the photography agency in Boston that had offered me a promotion only a week before leaving for Harbor's Edge. The deadline to accept the position was tomorrow. My stomach tightened. I had almost forgotten about it. "You knew?" I asked quietly. Noah nodded. "You told me the night you received the offer." I never said where it was. He smiled gently. "You did not have to. I knew how much it meant." I stared at the letter again. The promotion came with a larger salary, bigger commercial projects, and the opportunity most photographers spent years hoping to receive. It was everything I had worked toward since graduating from college. Yet standing inside the studio, surrounded by years of quiet kindness I had never noticed, the offer suddenly felt strangely distant. "I cannot ask you to stay," Noah said carefully. "That has never been the point." I looked up. "Then why build all of this?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because I wanted you to know that your dream already had a place waiting for it. Whether you choose it or not should always be your decision, not one made because you believed there was nowhere else to go." His words landed more heavily than anything I had heard all week. Back in Boston, every decision had always been measured by opportunity, income, and professional growth. Nobody ever asked whether the life waiting at the end of that path actually felt like home. We stepped outside onto the meadow where the breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and lavender across the hillside. Daniel was repairing a small wooden sign near the fence while Margaret watered newly planted flowers beside the entrance. Neither of them looked toward us. They quietly pretended to be busy, giving us privacy without making it obvious. I should probably go back, I admitted after several minutes. Saying the words aloud surprised even me. Noah did not react immediately. He simply nodded once. Your flight is tomorrow afternoon. You already checked. I wanted to make sure you would not miss it. There was no disappointment in his voice, only calm acceptance. Somehow that hurt more than if he had argued with me. You spent years building this, I said. And you are just letting me walk away? Noah looked toward the ocean with a small smile that carried both hope and sadness. Loving someone does not mean choosing for them. The sentence settled quietly between us. Daniel glanced up for only a brief moment before returning to his work, as though he understood exactly what Noah had left unsaid. I folded the promotion letter and slipped it back into the envelope, but instead of putting it into my pocket, I found myself staring at the studio one more time. For the first time in years, I realized the hardest decision was no longer about choosing between two jobs. It was about deciding which version of myself I wanted to become once I stopped running. That evening, I returned to the guest house, carrying far less certainty than I had brought with me only a week earlier. The envelope containing the promotion offer rested inside my backpack, untouched since leaving the barn. It felt strangely heavy now, not because of the paper inside, but because it represented a version of success I had spent years pursuing without ever asking whether it would make me happy. I sat on the porch overlooking the ocean as the last light disappeared beneath the horizon. Harbor lights flickered to life one by one, reflecting across the calm water like scattered stars. Margaret quietly stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She handed one to me before settling into the rocking chair beside mine. For several minutes, we watched the waves without speaking. Finally, she smiled. People always think the hardest part is finding the right place. I looked toward her. Is it not? She gently shook her head. No. The hardest part is believing you deserve to stay once you find it. Her words lingered in the cool evening air long after she returned inside, leaving me alone with thoughts I had avoided for years. I realized that every excuse I had made for postponing my own dreams had sounded practical at the time. Better income, better experience, better timing. Someday had always seemed responsible. Somehow I had never noticed that someday kept moving farther away. The next morning arrived quietly. I packed my suitcase, folded my clothes, and placed the promotion letter neatly inside the front pocket. Everything suggested I was leaving exactly as planned. Before checking out, I walked one last time toward the cliffs above the farm. Noah was already there repairing a section of wooden railing that overlooked the water. He smiled when he saw me approaching, though there was a softness in his expression that suggested he had already prepared himself for goodbye. I figured you would stop by before heading to the airport, he said. I could not leave without saying thank you. He leaned against the railing, looking out toward the ocean instead of directly at me. You never needed to thank me. I laughed quietly. You built an entire studio because of conversations I barely remembered having. I listened. Most people do not. He shrugged with that same unhurried calm I had admired since arriving in Harbor's Edge. Maybe they are simply too busy thinking about what to say next. The breeze lifted a strand of his hair across his forehead before he brushed it away. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Somehow the quiet itself had become part of every conversation we shared. After a while, Noah spoke again, his voice steady and sincere. I have been trying to find the right words all week, but I think simple is better. He finally turned toward me. Home is not this farm. Home is not that studio. Home is not even this town. He smiled gently. Home is wherever you decide your life can finally slow down enough for you to recognize yourself again. I felt something shift inside me. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a tide changing direction. Without thinking, I stepped closer and reached for his hand. He looked surprised for only a heartbeat, before his fingers naturally closed around mine. There was no grand declaration waiting beneath the moment, no audience, no music, no impossible promise about the future. Just 2 people standing above the ocean, finally choosing honesty over hesitation. I kept thinking you invited me here because you wanted me to stay, I admitted. Noah smiled. I invited you here because I wanted you to know that no matter what you chose, someone believed in your dream before you did. I laughed softly, feeling my eyes grow warm. That might be the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. We stood there hand in hand as gulls drifted above the cliffs and sunlight spread slowly across the fields below. For the first time in years, I was no longer thinking about the flight waiting that afternoon. Instead, I found myself wondering why I had ever believed that the life I wanted had to exist somewhere other than the place where my heart had finally become quiet. 4 seasons passed more quietly than I ever imagined they could. Spring filled the hills with wildflowers. Summer carried the scent of salt and fresh peaches through the market. Autumn painted the coastal roads in warm shades of gold, and winter wrapped Harbor's Edge in peaceful mornings that seemed to slow the entire world. During those months, the restored barn became more than a studio. Travelers stopped to admire local photography exhibits, families gathered for community events, and children proudly displayed pictures they had taken with borrowed cameras during weekend workshops. The empty frames that had once lined the walls gradually filled with stories instead of decorations. Every photograph captured ordinary moments that somehow became extraordinary when nobody was trying to hurry through them. Noah continued caring for the farm with the same quiet dedication that had first caught my attention. Daniel often stopped by after finishing work at the guest house, bringing fresh bread from town or helping prepare the gallery before each monthly exhibit. Margaret never arrived without homemade pie and a reminder that every successful opening deserved enough dessert for twice as many guests as expected. Harbor's Edge slowly became woven into my daily life, not through dramatic moments, but through countless small routines that made each day feel complete. Then one crisp October morning, my phone rang while I was organizing prints for a new exhibition. It was the photography agency. Months earlier, before everything changed, they had forwarded my portfolio to one of their partner studios in Chicago. I had almost forgotten the conversation. The director explained that a year-long documentary project had unexpectedly reopened because another photographer accepted a position overseas. They wanted someone who specialized in authentic community storytelling. They wanted me. The assignment would begin in 2 weeks. It was the kind of opportunity photographers rarely receive twice. I thanked them and asked for one day to think. That evening, I walked along the cliffs with Noah as waves rolled steadily against the rocks below. Neither of us spoke until we reached the old cedar tree overlooking the meadow. I handed him the printed offer letter. He read it slowly before folding it with the same care he had shown every important thing since the day we met. Chicago, he said quietly. I nodded. 1 year. He looked toward the fields stretching beyond the farmhouse, then smiled with a calmness that somehow made the moment even more emotional. You should go. I searched his face, hoping to find a reason to stay. What about us? Noah rested his hands on the weathered fence where we had shared so many conversations. This farm has been in my family for generations. I cannot imagine leaving it behind. He paused before looking back at me. And I would never ask you to walk away from a dream that finally arrived because you found yourself again. The silence between us held no resentment, only honesty. We both understood that love did not erase responsibility, and responsibility did not erase love. Early the next morning, the entire town gathered outside the guest house before sunrise. Margaret packed enough homemade cookies for a cross-country drive. Daniel quietly placed a small leather-bound journal into my backpack. Inside the front cover, he had written only one sentence. Every road eventually remembers the way home. Noah drove me to the airport without turning on the radio. We talked about weather, photography, the apple harvest, and the first gallery scheduled for next spring. We carefully avoided making promises neither of us could control. At the departure entrance, I looked at him for a long moment before smiling. I guess this is not really goodbye. Noah smiled back with the same peaceful expression I had noticed the first day we met, the expression of someone who had never been in a hurry. No, he said softly. It is simply the next chapter. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the terminal. Halfway to the entrance, I turned around one last time. Noah was still standing beside his truck, watching with quiet confidence instead of sadness. He raised one hand in a small wave, and I returned it before disappearing inside. A year can feel very long, yet some places wait without counting the days. Somewhere beyond Chicago, Beyond deadlines and airports, beyond photographs still waiting to be taken, a small coastal town continued greeting each sunrise at its own gentle pace. And every time the tide reached the cliffs beside the old barn, it sounded less like an ending and more like a promise that certain paths, no matter how far they wander, are meant to cross again.